The stagecoach wheels had broken 3 miles back, leaving Beatrice Norton stranded on a desolate mountain pass in the New Mexico territory with nothing but the clothes on her back and a carpet bag filled with teaching supplies she would never need now. It was November of 1877, and the sun had already begun its descent behind the jagged peaks of the Magdalena Mountains when the driver told her she would have to walk the rest of the way to Socorro, or wait until morning for help that might never come. Beatrice had chosen to walk, a decision she was now regretting as the temperature plummeted with each passing minute. The thin traveling dress she wore, appropriate for the warmer climate she had left in Santa Fe just 2 days prior, offered no protection against the biting wind that swept down from the snow-capped mountains. Her teeth began to chatter uncontrollably as she clutched her carpet bag tighter, her knuckles white from both cold and fear. The road, if it could even be called that, was little more than a rocky trail carved into the mountainside. On one side loomed a steep cliff face, on the other a drop so severe she could not see the bottom in the fading light. Beatrice kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, placing one foot in front of the other, trying desperately to ignore the trembling in her limbs that had nothing to do with exertion, and everything to do with the freezing temperature. She had come west to teach at the new schoolhouse in Socorro, answering an advertisement that had promised adventure and purpose. At 22 years old, Beatrice had been eager to escape the suffocating expectations of Boston society, where her parents had been pressuring her to marry a banker twice her age. The West had seemed like freedom, like possibility. Now it seemed like death. The chattering of her teeth grew so violent that she bit her tongue, tasting blood. Her fingers had gone numb inside her thin gloves, and she could no longer feel her toes in her leather boots. Panic began to set in as the sky darkened further. She would not survive the night out here. The realization hit her like a physical blow, and tears began to stream down her cheeks, freezing on her skin. That was when she heard it. The sound of hooves on stone, steady and deliberate. Beatrice turned, hope flaring in her chest, but what she saw made her freeze for an entirely different reason. The man approaching on horseback was unlike anyone she had ever seen in her sheltered Boston life. He sat astride a massive black horse, his frame so large and solid that he seemed carved from the mountain itself. Even from a distance, she could see the breadth of his shoulders, the thick muscles of his arms visible beneath the buckskin shirt he wore. His hair, dark as a raven's wing, hung past his shoulders in waves that caught the last rays of sunlight. A thick beard covered the lower half of his face, and his eyes, even from where she stood, seemed to pierce right through her. This was no gentleman from town. This was something wild, something dangerous. A mountain man, the kind her mother had warned her about in whispered tones when she announced her plans to head west. The kind of man who lived by his own rules, far from civilization and its constraints. Beatrice's instinct was to run, but she had nowhere to go. Her body would not obey her anyway, frozen as she was, teeth chattering so hard now that her jaw ached. She could only stand there and watch as he drew closer, his expression unreadable beneath that dark beard. Vincent Oakes had been tracking an elk when he spotted the woman on the trail. He had seen the broken stagecoach earlier, abandoned and tilted at an awkward angle, and had wondered about its passengers. Now he had his answer. The fool driver had left a city woman alone on the mountain with night falling and the temperature dropping toward freezing. As he drew nearer, he could see her trembling, could hear the violent chattering of her teeth even over the sound of his horse's hooves. She was young, probably early 20s, with auburn hair that had come loose from its pins and now whipped around her face in the wind. Her dress, A ridiculous scrap of fabric better suited to a parlor than a mountain trail clung to her shaking frame. Her eyes, wide with fear and cold, watched him approach with the wariness of a cornered animal. Vincent had little use for words at the best of times. He had lived alone in these mountains for the better part of 6 years, ever since the war had ended, and he had found himself unable to stomach the sight of civilization anymore. The things he had seen, the things he had done in those blood-soaked years, had carved away the part of him that knew how to make small talk and pleasantries. He spoke to his horse, to the wind, to the elk he hunted, but rarely to people. The few times a year he ventured into Socorro for supplies, he conducted his business with nods and hand gestures, leaving the storekeepers to whisper about the strange, silent mountain man who paid in gold nuggets and furs. But he did not need words to see that this woman would die if he left her here. The knowledge settled into his bones with absolute certainty. Vincent reined in his horse beside her and dismounted in one fluid motion. The woman took a step back, her carpetbag clutched to her chest like a shield. Up close, he could see that her lips had taken on a bluish tinge, and her entire body shook with such violence that he wondered how she remained standing. Without a word, Vincent shrugged out of his heavy coat. It was made of elk hide, lined with rabbit fur, and had kept him warm through countless winters in these mountains. The coat was massive, built to fit his 6'4" frame and the thick muscles that came from years of chopping wood, hauling game, and surviving in country that killed weaker men. He held it out to her. Beatrice stared at the coat, then at the man offering it. His eyes, she realized now, were a startling shade of gray, like storm clouds over the ocean. They held no menace, no threat. They held only a kind of quiet certainty, as if there was no question that she would take what he offered. But she hesitated. To accept help from a stranger, especially a man like this, went against everything she had been taught. Yet the cold was so intense, so all-consuming that her body made the decision for her. Her hand, shaking violently, reached out and took the coat. The moment the heavy garment settled around her shoulders, warmth enveloped her. The coat was enormous, hanging nearly to her ankles, the sleeves extending far past her hands. But it was warm, gloriously warm, and it smelled of pine smoke and leather and something indefinably masculine. Beatrice pulled it tighter around herself, and for the first time since the stagecoach broke down, she felt like she might actually survive. Vincent watched her disappear into his coat, looking small and fragile wrapped in the heavy garment. Her shaking had already begun to subside, though her teeth still chattered. He turned without a word and walked back to his horse, pulling a canteen from his saddle bag. When he offered it to her, she took it with both hands, fumbling with the cap until he reached out and opened it for her with one twist of his large hand. The water was cold but clean, and Beatrice drank deeply, not realizing how thirsty she had been until the liquid hit her parched throat. She handed the canteen back, and he secured it without looking at her, his movements efficient and practiced. Then he was mounting his horse again, and Beatrice felt panic surge through her. He was leaving. He had given her his coat and water, and now he was leaving her here to continue her impossible walk to Socorro in the dark. But instead of riding away, Vincent held down his hand to her. Beatrice looked at the offered hand, rough and calloused, and twice the size of her own. She looked at his face, at those gray eyes that waited with infinite patience. She looked at the darkening sky and the treacherous trail ahead. Then she placed her hand in his. His grip was gentle despite the obvious strength in those fingers. He pulled her up behind him on the horse as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. Beatrice had never ridden astride before, had never been this close to a man who was not family. The impropriety of it would have scandalized her mother into fits. But survival, she was learning, cared nothing for propriety. She settled behind him on the horse, unsure where to put her hands. The animal shifted beneath her, and she instinctively grabbed onto Vincent's shirt to keep from sliding off. She felt the solid wall of muscle beneath the buckskin, the heat radiating from his body despite having given up his coat. He reached back without looking, took both her hands and placed them around his waist. Heat flooded Beatrice's cheeks, though whether from embarrassment or the lingering cold she could not say. She could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, the solidity of him. Her carpetbag was forgotten on the ground, and she found she did not care. What use were teaching supplies if she froze to death? Vincent clicked his tongue, and the horse began moving down the trail with sure-footed confidence. They rode in complete silence, the only sounds the clip of hooves on stone and the whistle of wind through the mountain passes. Beatrice pressed closer to his back as the temperature continued to drop, grateful for the warmth of both the coat and the man. They rode for what felt like hours, but was likely less than one. The trail eventually widened and began to descend, and in the distance, Beatrice could see the flickering lights of what must be Socorro. Relief flooded through her, so intense it made her dizzy, but Vincent did not head toward the town. Instead, he guided the horse off the main trail onto a narrower path that led higher into the mountains. Beatrice's relief turned to fresh fear. Where was he taking her? She had been foolish to trust him, foolish to accept his help. Now she was alone with a stranger, heading away from civilization, with no way to defend herself or escape. As if sensing her tension, Vincent spoke for the first time. His voice was deep and rough from disuse, the words coming slowly as if he had to remember how to form them. Cabin closer. Warmer. Just those 3 words, but they carried a weight of truth that somehow eased her fear. Beatrice realized she was still gripping his waist, her fingers clutched in the fabric of his shirt. She loosened her hold slightly but did not let go. They climbed higher and the air grew thinner and colder. Snow began to fall, light flakes at first, then heavier. Beatrice was grateful for the massive coat and for the warmth of the man in front of her. She had stopped shaking, though she could still feel the deep chill in her bones. When they finally emerged into a clearing, Beatrice saw the cabin. It was solid and well-built, constructed of thick logs with a stone chimney from which no smoke currently rose. A small barn stood nearby, and various tools and equipment were arranged with military precision around the property. This was not some ramshackle shelter. This was a home, built with care and skill. Vincent dismounted and reached up for her. Beatrice slid down into his arms, and for a moment he held her weight effortlessly before setting her on her feet. Her legs nearly buckled, stiff from the cold and the ride. His hand steadied her elbow until she found her balance. He led her to the cabin door, opened it, and gestured for her to enter. Beatrice hesitated on the threshold. To enter a man's home, unchaperoned, unmarried, would ruin her reputation beyond repair if anyone ever found out. But then again, she had already ridden alone with him through the mountains, had already accepted his coat and his help. And more importantly, she could see her breath in the air, and her fingers had gone numb again. She stepped inside. The interior of the cabin was sparse but clean. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a neatly made bed in one corner and a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs in the center of the room. Shelves lined the walls, holding supplies and equipment organized with the same precision she had seen outside. Animal furs were stacked in one corner, and various tools hung from pegs. It was the home of a man who lived alone but lived deliberately. Vincent moved past her to the fireplace and began building a fire with practiced efficiency. Within minutes, Flames crackled to life and heat began to seep into the small space. Beatrice stood near the door, still wrapped in his coat, watching him work. Even crouched by the fire, his size was apparent. His shoulders strained against his buckskin shirt as he arranged the logs, and she could see the play of muscles in his back and arms. This was a man who had carved his existence from the wilderness through sheer physical strength and determination. Once the fire was blazing, Vincent stood and moved to a pot hanging near the hearth. He ladled water into it from a bucket and set it to heat, then turned to a shelf and began gathering items. Beatrice watched, still silent, as he prepared what looked like tea, dropping pine needles and some kind of dried herbs into a cup. When the water was hot, he poured it over the mixture and brought the cup to her, pressing it into her hands. The heat of the cup seeped into her frozen fingers and she sighed with relief. She raised it to her lips and sipped cautiously. The tea was bitter but not unpleasant, with an earthy flavor that warmed her from the inside out. "Thank you," she whispered, the first words she had spoken to him. Vincent nodded once, then turned away to tend to his horse. He disappeared outside, leaving Beatrice alone in the cabin. She moved closer to the fire, finally allowing herself to relax slightly. She was safe, she was warm, and somehow, despite all her mother's warnings about dangerous mountain men, she trusted that this particular mountain man meant her no harm. When Vincent returned, he carried her forgotten carpet bag, which he must have retrieved from where she dropped it on the trail. He set it near the door without comment, then moved to the shelves and began preparing food. Beatrice watched as he sliced dried meat and bread, setting them on 2 tin plates with the ease of long practice. When he handed her one of the plates, she realized she was ravenous. They ate in silence, sitting on opposite sides of the room. Beatrice perched on one of the wooden chairs while Vincent sat on a stool near the fire, his long legs stretched out before him. She tried not to stare, but it was difficult. Everything about him was so different from the men she had known in Boston, with their soft hands and softer lives. This man was hard in every way, honed by the mountains and solitude into something both intimidating and oddly compelling. After they ate, Vincent stood and pulled a heavy blanket from a chest near the bed. He handed it to Beatrice, then gestured to the bed itself. "You sleep there." Beatrice's eyes widened. "But where will you sleep?" He pointed to the floor near the fire. "I cannot take your bed," she protested. "This is your home. I am the intruder." Vincent's gray eyes met hers for a long moment. Then he spoke again, his voice that same low rumble. "You need rest. You are safe here." There was something in the way he said it, a certainty and quiet strength that made Beatrice believe him completely. She nodded slowly and moved toward the bed, still wrapped in his enormous coat. She sat on the edge and began to unlace her boots, her fingers clumsy with lingering cold. Vincent turned away, giving her privacy, and began arranging furs on the floor to create a makeshift bed for himself. Beatrice removed her boots and stockings, setting them near the fire to dry. She hesitated over the coat, then decided to keep it on. Her dress alone would not be warm enough, and besides, the coat made her feel safe, surrounded as she was by the scent and warmth of the man who had saved her life. She slid beneath the blankets on the bed, which smelled of pine and fresh air. The mattress was stuffed with something soft, perhaps dried grass or feathers, and the furs piled on top were luxuriously warm. Within moments, the heat from the fire and the exhaustion of the day overtook her. Her eyes grew heavy, and despite being in a strange place with a strange man, Beatrice fell into a deep sleep. Vincent waited until he heard her breathing deepen and even out before he allowed himself to relax. He stoked the fire, ensuring it would burn through the night, then settled onto his makeshift bed on the floor. The cabin felt different with another person in it, smaller somehow, despite the woman being so tiny. The silence felt different too. Usually, the quiet of his cabin was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire or the wind outside. Now, there was the soft sound of her breathing, the occasional rustle as she shifted in her sleep. He stared at the ceiling beams he had hewn himself, thinking about the woman asleep in his bed. She was city-bred, that much was obvious. Everything about her, from her impractical clothing to the way she moved, spoke of a life lived far from the harsh realities of the frontier. Yet she had not screamed when she saw him, had not fainted or carried on the way some women might. She had been afraid, yes, but she had also been brave. She had accepted his help without hysterics, had ridden through the mountains without complaint, had asked for nothing more than what he offered. Vincent was not a man prone to curiosity about others. He had left that part of himself behind after the war, along with his ability to care about the small details of civilized life. But he found himself wondering about this woman. What had brought her to New Mexico? Where had she been going when the stagecoach broke down? Did she have family waiting for her in Socorro? He pushed the questions away. Tomorrow he would take her down to the town, and she would disappear back into the world of people and words and complications that he had left behind. Tonight she was simply a problem he had solved, a life he had saved. Nothing more. But as he finally drifted off to sleep, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing, Vincent could not quite convince himself that was true. Beatrice woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of movement. For a moment, she could not remember where she was. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back, and she sat up quickly, clutching the blankets to her chest. Vincent stood near the fireplace, his back to her, preparing something in a pan over the fire. Morning light streamed through the single window, illuminating the cabin in shades of gold. He had already been outside, she realized. His hair was damp, as if he had washed in the cold stream she could hear babbling somewhere nearby, and he wore a different shirt, this one a faded blue that had seen better days. "Good morning," Beatrice said softly. Vincent turned, and for the first time she saw something that might have been a smile flicker across his face, though it was hard to tell beneath the beard. He nodded to her and gestured to the table, where he had already set out a cup. Beatrice stood, very aware that she was still wearing his coat over her wrinkled traveling dress, her hair a tangled mess around her shoulders. She must look a fright, but Vincent did not seem to notice or care. He poured coffee into her cup, the liquid dark and strong-smelling, then returned to whatever he was cooking. She sat at the table and sipped the coffee. It was bitter and harsh, nothing like the delicate blend her mother served in their Boston parlor, but it was hot and it cleared the last cobwebs of sleep from her mind. As she drank, she watched Vincent work. He moved with an economy of motion, nothing wasted, everything purposeful. He was cooking eggs, she realized, and some kind of meat. Her stomach growled audibly, and she blushed. Vincent brought 2 plates to the table and sat across from her. The chair seemed too small for his large frame, and Beatrice had to suppress a slightly hysterical giggle at the incongruity of it all. Here she was, having breakfast with a mountain man in his cabin, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. They ate in the same companionable silence as the night before. Beatrice found herself stealing glances at him between bites. In the morning light, she could see him more clearly. His face was weathered from years of exposure to sun and wind, with fine lines at the corners of his eyes. Those eyes, she noticed, were remarkably expressive despite his silence, constantly observing, assessing. His hands were scarred and calloused, the hands of a man who worked hard for his survival. Yet they moved with surprising gentleness as he handled the tin cup and fork. After they finished eating, Vincent stood and gathered the dishes. He moved to a basin near the window and began washing them with the same methodical care he seemed to apply to everything. Beatrice felt useless sitting there, so she stood and approached him. "May I help?" Vincent glanced at her, then shook his head. But he moved slightly to the side, making room at the basin. Beatrice interpreted this as an invitation and picked up a cloth, drying the dishes as he washed them. They worked side by side in silence, and Beatrice found it oddly peaceful. No one in her Boston life would believe that she, Beatrice Norton, who had never washed a dish in her life thanks to their household staff, was standing in a mountain cabin drying tin plates beside a man who looked like he could wrestle bears. When the dishes were done and put away, Vincent turned to her. He seemed to be considering something, his brow furrowed slightly. Then he spoke. "Sakaro is half a day's ride. We should leave soon if you want to arrive before dark." Reality crashed back into Beatrice's peaceful morning. Of course. He would take her to Sakaro, deliver her to whatever fate awaited there, and then return to his solitary life in the mountains. This interlude, this strange, quiet connection they seemed to have formed, would end. "Yes," she heard herself say. "Yes, of course. I should get to Sakaro. They are expecting me." Something flickered in Vincent's eyes, but it was gone before she could identify it. He nodded and moved to prepare his horse for the journey. Beatrice returned to the bed and began to straighten the blankets, trying to leave things as neat as she had found them. She gathered her stockings and boots from near the fire, now dry and warm, and put them on. She ran her fingers through her tangled hair, trying to work out the worst of the knots, wishing desperately for a mirror and a brush. When she emerged from the cabin, Vincent was leading his horse from the small barn. The animal was saddled and ready, and her carpet bag was already secured behind the saddle. Vincent approached her and held out his hand for his coat. Beatrice hesitated, not wanting to give up the warmth and comfort of it, but knowing she must. She shrugged out of the heavy garment and handed it to him. The morning air was cold, but nothing like the previous evening. Her traveling dress would be sufficient for the ride to town. Vincent took the coat, and their fingers brushed in the exchange. Beatrice felt a jolt of something she could not name at the contact. She looked up and found him watching her with those storm-gray eyes, an intensity in his gaze that made her breath catch. Then he was turning away, shrugging into the coat, and the moment was broken. He mounted his horse and held down his hand to her, just as he had the night before. Beatrice placed her hand in his and let him pull her up behind him. She settled into position, her arms going around his waist with less hesitation than before, and they began the journey down the mountain. The trail in daylight was both more and less frightening than it had been at dusk. She could now see exactly how precarious the path was in places, how far the drop was on one side. But she could also see the beauty of the landscape, the way the morning sun painted the rocks in shades of red and gold, the distant peaks still capped with snow, the endless expanse of desert spreading out below them. As they rode, Beatrice found herself memorizing the feel of this moment. The solid warmth of Vincent's back against her chest, the sway of the horse beneath them, the clean smell of pine and mountain air. She knew that once they reached Sakaro, once she stepped into her role as the town's new schoolteacher, this would all seem like a dream. But for now, for these few hours, she let herself simply exist in the moment. They stopped once to water the horse at a small stream. Vincent helped her down and offered her water from his canteen. Beatrice drank, then wandered a few steps away to take care of personal necessities behind a large boulder. When she returned, she found Vincent standing near the stream, staring out at the landscape with an expression that might have been longing. "It is beautiful here," Beatrice said softly, coming to stand beside him. Vincent glanced at her, then back at the view. Yes. Have you lived in these mountains long? 6 years. Beatrice waited, hoping he would elaborate, but he said nothing more. She tried a different approach. I came from Boston. I am supposed to be the new schoolteacher in Sakaro. This earned her another glance. Supposed to be. Well, I am still the schoolteacher, I suppose, assuming they have not found someone else after my stagecoach failed to arrive yesterday. They will wait, Vincent said with certainty. Teachers are hard to find out here. It was the most words he had strung together at once, and Beatrice felt absurdly pleased to hear them. Have you been to Sakaro often? Sometimes, for supplies. You know the school. I know the building. It is new, built this past spring. Beatrice felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. What if she was not adequate for the task? What if the children were too wild, too different from the students she had practiced teaching during her training in Boston? What if she failed and had to return home in disgrace? As if sensing her distress, Vincent turned to her fully. His eyes searched her face, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle. You will do well. How can you know that? You are brave. You survived the mountain. You will survive children. Beatrice felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected kindness. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. You saved my life. Vincent shook his head. I gave you a coat. You did the rest. Before she could respond, he was moving back toward the horse, clearly ready to continue. Beatrice followed, and once again he lifted her onto the horse's back with effortless strength. They rode on. The landscape gradually changed as they descended. The pine forests gave way to juniper and pinon, and eventually to the scrubby desert vegetation that surrounded Sakaro. The town came into view in the early afternoon. A collection of adobe buildings and wooden structures clustered along the Rio Grande. It was larger than Beatrice had expected, with several streets and what looked like a bustling plaza at its center. As they rode into town, people stopped and stared. Beatrice realized what they must look like, her seated behind the massive mountain man, her dress wrinkled and her hair wild. She could already hear the gossip that would spread, but there was nothing to be done about it now. Vincent rode directly to a 2-story building with a sign that read, Sakaro Boarding House. He dismounted and helped Beatrice down, then retrieved her carpet bag from behind the saddle. An older woman emerged from the boarding house, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes widened when she saw Beatrice. Lord have mercy, you must be Miss Norton. We have been worried sick. When the stagecoach came in yesterday with news that it had broken down and the passengers were stranded, we did not know what to think. Beatrice stepped forward, smoothing her dress self-consciously. Yes, I am Beatrice Norton. I apologize for the delay and the worry. The stagecoach broke an axle and I had to walk until. She turned to gesture toward Vincent, but he had already mounted his horse and was riding away. Wait. Beatrice called out, but he did not stop or turn around. She stood watching him disappear down the street, feeling an unexpected sense of loss. She had not even properly thanked him. She did not know his name. She might never see him again. That was Vincent Oakes, the older woman said, following Beatrice's gaze. Lives up in the mountains, keeps to himself mostly. Good man, though, real good man. Looks like he helped you out. Yes, Beatrice said softly. Yes, he did. The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Henderson, the owner of the boarding house, ushered Beatrice inside with a stream of chatter. She showed Beatrice to a small but clean room on the 2nd floor, explaining that the town council had arranged for her lodging here until she could find more permanent accommodations. She brought hot water for washing and promised to have a proper meal ready within the hour. Left alone in her room, Beatrice sank onto the bed and let out a long breath. She was safe. She was in Sakaro. Her new life was beginning. This was what she had wanted. what she had traveled all this way for. So why did she feel like she had left something important behind on that mountain? Over the next few days, Beatrice threw herself into preparing for her teaching duties. The school was indeed new, a simple wooden structure with one large room and rows of wooden desks. The town council had stocked it with basic supplies, and Beatrice spent hours organizing books, preparing lessons, and making the space welcoming. The townspeople were kind and curious, stopping by to introduce themselves and welcome her to Socorro. She met merchants and ranchers, mothers eager to discuss their children's education, and town officials who clearly took pride in having secured a real teacher from back east. But despite the warmth of her welcome and the excitement of her new position, Beatrice found her thoughts constantly drifting back to the mountain, to the silent cabin and the man who had shared it with her, to storm gray eyes and gentle hands, to the feeling of safety she had experienced wrapped in his coat, riding through the mountains with her arms around his waist. She told herself she was being foolish. Vincent Oakes had done what any decent person would do. He had helped someone in need. It meant nothing beyond that. The fact that she could not stop thinking about him, that she lay awake at night remembering the solid warmth of his back against her chest, that she found herself scanning every face on the street hoping to see him, was simply a reaction to the dramatic circumstances of their meeting. At least, that was what she told herself. School began on a Monday morning in late November. Beatrice wore her best dress, a deep green that brought out the color of her eyes and pinned her hair up in a neat bun. She stood at the door of the schoolhouse as children of various ages filed in, some eager, some reluctant, all curious about their new teacher. There were 23 students in total, ranging from 6-year-old twins learning their letters to a lanky 15-year-old boy who clearly thought he was too old for school. Beatrice greeted each one by name, having memorized the roster the town council provided, and directed them to seats. The first day was chaotic, as first days always are. Beatrice established rules, assessed skill levels, and began the delicate work of building a classroom community. By the time she dismissed the students in the afternoon, she was exhausted but satisfied. This was what she had come west to do, and despite the challenges, she knew she could do it well. As the weeks passed, Beatrice settled into a routine. She woke early, prepared lessons, taught throughout the day, and spent evenings grading assignments and planning for the next day. She took her meals at the boarding house, where Mrs. Henderson proved to be an endless source of town gossip and motherly advice. She made friends with some of the other women in town, attending church on Sundays and occasionally joining in social gatherings. It was a good life, the life she had wanted, but something was missing. December arrived, bringing colder weather and the threat of snow. One Saturday afternoon, Beatrice was walking back to the boarding house after purchasing some supplies at the general store when she saw him. Vincent stood outside the store, loading supplies onto a pack mule. He wore the same elk hide coat he had given her that night on the mountain, and his long, dark hair was tied back with a leather cord. He looked just as large, just as solid, just as compelling as she remembered. Beatrice's heart began to race. She had not seen him since he dropped her off at the boarding house over a month ago. She had begun to think she might never see him again. She approached slowly, suddenly nervous. "Mr. Oakes," he turned, and recognition flickered in his gray eyes. He nodded to her, "Miss Norton," so he knew her name. Somehow that made her absurdly happy. "I never got to properly thank you for helping me. You saved my life." Vincent shook his head just as he had on the mountain. "You would have survived." "I do not think so. I was freezing. I would not have made it to town." He studied her for a long moment, and Beatrice felt heat rise to her cheeks under that intense gaze. Finally, he spoke. "You are well. The teaching is good. Yes, very well. The children are wonderful, challenging but wonderful. And the town has been so welcoming. Vincent nodded, seeming satisfied with this answer. He turned back to his supplies. Beatrice knew she should walk away, let him finish his business and return to his mountain. But she found she could not make herself leave. "Do you come to town often?" "Once a month for supplies." Will you come again?" "Next month." Vincent turned back to her, surprise evident in his expression. "Yes, perhaps." Beatrice hesitated, aware that what she was about to suggest was forward, possibly scandalous. "Perhaps we could have coffee." "At the hotel. They have a dining room. It is very respectable. I would like to thank you properly. And I would like to hear about the mountains. The children are fascinated when I tell them about different ecosystems and wildlife." It was a flimsy excuse, and they both knew it. But Vincent considered her offer seriously, his gray eyes searching her face as if trying to determine her true intentions. "All right," he said finally. "Next month, when I come for supplies." Beatrice felt a smile break across her face, bright and genuine. "Wonderful. I look forward to it." Vincent nodded once more, then returned to his loading. Beatrice walked back to the boarding house, her steps lighter than they had been in weeks. Mrs. Henderson noticed immediately. "You are looking cheerful, dear. Something good happened." Beatrice hung up her coat and tried to school her expression into something more neutral. "Just a pleasant afternoon. The weather is nice for December." But Mrs. Henderson was not fooled. She had run a boarding house for 30 years and had seen more than her share of young women with that particular glow. "Ran into someone in town, did you?" "Just Mr. Oakes. I wanted to thank him again for his help when I first arrived." "Vincent Oakes, Mrs. Henderson said thoughtfully, settling into her rocking chair with her knitting. "Now there is a story. Came out here after the war, they say. Fought for the Union, saw some terrible things. Could not go back to regular life after. Built that cabin up in the mountains and has barely said 2 words to anyone since. But like I said before, he is a good man. Helped the widow Morrison when her roof collapsed in a storm couple years back. Fixed it up without being asked, without accepting payment. Brought meat down to the mission during the hard winter of '75 when people were going hungry. Does not talk much, but he pays attention. He notices when people need help." Beatrice listened to this recitation, filing away each detail about Vincent like precious treasures. "He seems very kind." "Kind is one word for it," Mrs. Henderson said, her needles clicking rhythmically. "Lonely is another. Man should not live alone like that. It is not natural. Perhaps he prefers solitude. Perhaps, or perhaps he just has not found a reason to prefer something else." Beatrice felt Mrs. Henderson's knowing gaze on her, and busied herself with arranging her purchases, unwilling to examine too closely what the older woman was implying. The next month passed with agonizing slowness. Beatrice taught her classes, celebrated Christmas with the town, and tried not to count the days until Vincent's next supply run. She told herself she was being ridiculous, that she was building up a simple coffee meeting into something it was not. But she could not help the flutter of excitement in her stomach every time she thought about seeing him again. When January finally arrived, Beatrice found herself watching for Vincent every time she went into town. It was foolish, she knew. He could come on any day at any time. But she watched anyway. She finally spotted him on a Saturday morning, once again loading supplies outside the general store. This time, she did not hesitate. She walked directly up to him, her heart pounding but her step sure. "Mr. Oakes." He turned, and that same flicker of recognition crossed his face. But this time, something else was there too, something that might have been pleasure. "Miss Norton, are you finished with your supplies? I thought perhaps that coffee I mentioned. I would like that." They walked together to the hotel. and Beatrice was acutely aware of the curious glances from townspeople. Vincent's tall frame towered over her, and she noticed how people stepped aside to let them pass, offering polite nods to Vincent that he returned with his characteristic brevity. The hotel dining room was nearly empty at this hour, for which Beatrice was grateful. They settled at a table near the window, and a waitress brought coffee and slices of apple pie without being asked. Clearly, Vincent was more known in town than his reclusive nature would suggest. Beatrice wrapped her hands around the warm cup and tried to think of something to say. She, who had never had trouble making conversation in Boston drawing rooms, suddenly found herself tongue-tied. Vincent saved her the trouble. "How is the teaching?" Beatrice relaxed slightly. This was safe territory. "It is wonderful, challenging, but wonderful. I have students from 6 to 15, all at different levels. Some can barely read, others are ready for advanced mathematics. It keeps me on my toes." "You enjoy it?" It was not a question, but Beatrice answered anyway. "I do. Very much. I feel like I am making a difference, you know. Helping these children have opportunities they might not otherwise have." Vincent nodded, sipping his coffee and watching her with those attentive gray eyes. Emboldened by his attention, Beatrice continued, "What about you? What do you do up in the mountains? Besides survive, I mean." A ghost of a smile crossed Vincent's face. "I trap, hunt, sell the furs and meat. I have a small garden in the summer. I chop wood. I repair things. Do you not get lonely?" The question was too personal, Beatrice realized as soon as it left her mouth. But Vincent did not seem offended. He considered it seriously, his large hands wrapped around the delicate china cup. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I got used to the quiet. After the war, the noise of cities, of people, it was too much. The mountains are peaceful. Mrs. Henderson said you fought for the Union." Vincent's expression shuddered slightly, and Beatrice wished she had not mentioned it, but after a moment he nodded. "Yes, 4 years I saw things." He paused, his jaw working. "The quiet helps. Up there, I do not have to remember so much." Beatrice reached across the table without thinking and placed her hand over his. His hand was so large that hers looked tiny in comparison, but she squeezed gently. "I am sorry. I cannot imagine what that must have been like." Vincent stared at their joined hands for a long moment. Then, slowly, he turned his hand over and squeezed back, his touch gentle despite the obvious strength in those calloused fingers. "It was a long time ago." They sat like that for a moment, hands joined across the table, the connection between them palpable. Then Vincent slowly withdrew his hand, and Beatrice felt the loss of contact like a physical ache. They talked for another hour, the conversation flowing more easily as time went on. Vincent spoke in his measured way about the mountains, about the animals he saw, about the change of seasons. Beatrice told him about her students, about the funny things they said, about her small triumphs and frustrations. It was the most she had heard Vincent speak, and she treasured every word. When they finally left the hotel, the sun was high in the sky. Vincent walked her back to the boarding house, his long strides shortened to match her pace. At the door, Beatrice turned to him. "Thank you for the coffee. I enjoyed our talk." "I did too. Will you?" She hesitated, then pushed forward. "Will you come again? Next month? We could talk again." Vincent studied her face, and Beatrice had the sense that he was trying to solve some complicated puzzle. Finally, he nodded. "I would like that." Beatrice's smile was bright enough to rival the winter sun. "So would I." She watched him walk away, tall and solid and solitary, and felt something shift in her chest. This was dangerous, she knew. She was developing feelings for a man who lived alone in the mountains, who clearly preferred isolation to society. A man so different from her in every way that any connection between them seemed impossible. But as she climbed the stairs to her room, Beatrice could not bring herself to care about the impossibility of it. All she could think about was the gentle pressure of his hand on hers, and the way his gray eyes had warmed when he looked at her. The pattern continued through winter and into spring. Once a month, Vincent would come to town for supplies and Beatrice would meet him for coffee. Sometimes they talked for hours, sometimes they sat in comfortable silence. Vincent slowly opened up, sharing small details about his life, his thoughts, his observations of the natural world. Beatrice told him about her childhood in Boston, about her desire to do something meaningful with her life, about the small triumphs and challenges of teaching. With each meeting, the connection between them deepened. Beatrice found herself thinking about Vincent constantly, planning what she would tell him at their next meeting, remembering things he had said. She noticed details about him that she had missed before: the way his eyes crinkled when he was amused, the precise way he moved his hands when explaining something, the rare occasions when a full smile would break through his serious expression and transform his entire face. For his part, Vincent began to look forward to his trips to town in a way he never had before. The supplies were necessary, but seeing Beatrice had become equally essential. He thought about her in his quiet cabin, remembering the musical sound of her laugh, the intelligence that shone in her green eyes, the gentle way she spoke about her students. He found himself noticing things in the mountains that he wanted to tell her: about an eagle's nest, the first wildflowers of spring, the way the sunset painted the peaks in shades of purple and gold. The townspeople noticed, of course. Socorro was too small for anything to go unnoticed, and the sight of their reclusive mountain man having regular coffee meetings with the pretty schoolteacher was too delicious a piece of gossip to ignore. But the talk was mostly kind. People liked Beatrice, and they respected Vincent. If the two of them found comfort in each other's company, well, who could fault them for that? It was May when everything changed. Beatrice was dismissed her students for the day and was tidying the classroom when she heard a commotion outside. Raised voices, the sound of horses. She stepped out of the schoolhouse to see what was happening and found a group of men on horseback riding down the main street, firing guns into the air. Her heart seized with fear. She had heard about this kind of thing, outlaws riding into small towns to rob and terrorize. But Socorro had always seemed so safe, so peaceful. One of the townsmen ran past her toward the sheriff's office and Beatrice grabbed his arm. "What is happening?" "Outlaws," the man said grimly. "The McCready gang. They have been raiding towns up and down the Rio Grande. Looks like it is our turn." Beatrice's mind immediately went to her students. Most had already made it home, but some of the older ones had mentioned going to the general store after school. She had to make sure they were safe. She ran toward the center of town, where the outlaws had congregated. There were 5 of them, rough-looking men with guns and cruel eyes. They had already rounded up several townspeople, ordering them to hand over their valuables. The sheriff, an older man named Bob Talbot, was trying to negotiate with them, his hands held up in a placating gesture. Beatrice scanned the frightened faces and spotted 2 of her students, 13-year-old Emma and her younger brother Thomas, huddled near the entrance to the general store. They looked terrified. Without thinking, Beatrice started toward them. She needed to get them to safety. One of the outlaws spotted her movement and swung his horse around, blocking her path. He was a big man with a scarred face and a leer that made Beatrice's skin crawl. "Well now, what do we have here? Pretty little thing, are not you?" Beatrice stopped, her heart pounding. "Please, I just want to get those children to safety." The outlaw laughed, a harsh sound that held no humor. "Children will be fine. You, on the other hand, might want to be nice to me. I am in a position to make your day very good or very bad, understand? Fear coursed through Beatrice, but she lifted her chin and met the outlaw's eyes. I understand that you are a bully and a coward who threatens unarmed people. The outlaw's face darkened with anger. He dismounted and strode toward her, his hand moving to the gun at his hip. Seems like you need to learn some manners, schoolteacher. Beatrice took a step back, her courage faltering in the face of real danger. The sheriff was shouting something. Other townspeople were crying out, but everything seemed to slow down and fade away as the outlaw reached for her. Then the outlaw stopped mid-stride, his eyes widening as he looked at something behind Beatrice. She turned and felt relief flood through her so intensely that her knees nearly buckled. Vincent sat astride his black horse at the end of the street, as still and solid as the mountains themselves. He was not due in town for another week, but there he was, as if conjured by her desperate need. Even from this distance, Beatrice could see the cold fury in his gray eyes. The outlaw recovered from his surprise and spat on the ground. This does not concern you, mountain man. Best ride on if you know what is good for you. Vincent dismounted with that same fluid grace Beatrice remembered from their first meeting. He walked forward slowly, his massive frame radiating menace with each step. He still said nothing, but he did not need to. Everything about him spoke of controlled violence, of a man who knew exactly how dangerous he could be. The other outlaws were watching now, hands moving toward their guns. Their leader, a thin man with cold eyes, rode forward. You got a death wish, friend. There are 5 of us and 1 of you. Vincent's voice, when he finally spoke, was colder than Beatrice had ever heard it. Let them go. The leader laughed. Or what? You will take on all 5 of us? I do not think so. I fought in the war, Vincent said, his voice carrying clearly through the tense silence. I have killed more men than I can count. Most of them were better armed and better trained than you. Let them go. Something in his voice, in his absolute certainty, made the leader hesitate. Vincent used that moment to move, crossing the remaining distance to Beatrice with surprising speed. He positioned himself between her and the outlaws, his body a living shield. Get behind me, he said quietly to Beatrice. Get everyone inside the store. Beatrice did not argue. She ran to Emma and Thomas, gathering them and herding them toward the store entrance. Other townspeople followed, understanding what Vincent was trying to do. The scarred outlaw who had threatened Beatrice made a move to stop them, but Vincent's hand shot out and grabbed the man's wrist with crushing force. The outlaw cried out in pain as Vincent twisted, forcing him to drop his gun. Then Vincent released him with a shove that sent the man stumbling backward. Next person who moves toward them loses more than their gun, Vincent said, his voice deadly calm. The leader's face flushed with anger. Kill him, he ordered his men. 4 guns drew and pointed at Vincent. Beatrice screamed his name from the doorway of the store, but Vincent did not move, did not flinch. He simply stood there, facing down 4 armed men, his hands loose at his sides. The crack of gunfire split the air, and Beatrice's scream caught in her throat. But it was not the outlaws who had fired. Sheriff Talbot and several deputized townsmen had used the distraction to retrieve their weapons, and now they had the outlaws surrounded. The standoff was at an end before it had truly begun. The outlaws, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, surrendered their weapons. Within minutes, they were bound and being marched toward the jail. The danger was over. Beatrice ran from the store and threw herself at Vincent without thinking. Her arms wrapped around his waist, and she pressed her face against his chest, shaking with reaction. You could have been killed. You could have been killed, and it would have been my fault. Vincent's arms came around her carefully, as if he was afraid she might break. One large hand stroked her hair gently. You are safe, that is what matters. But you could have died. I have faced worse." Beatrice pulled back enough to look up at him, tears streaming down her face. "Do not joke, this is not funny, I cannot lose you, I cannot." The words hung in the air between them, the full weight of their meaning settling over both of them. Beatrice realized what she had just revealed, the depth of feeling she had just admitted to. But she could not bring herself to take it back, to deny what she now knew was true. She loved him. She loved this quiet, strong, solitary man who had given her his coat without a word, who faced down 5 armed outlaws to protect her, who made her feel safer and more seen than anyone ever had. Vincent's gray eyes searched her face, and she saw wonder there, and something that might have been fear. His hand came up to cup her cheek, his calloused thumb wiping away her tears with infinite gentleness. "Beatrice," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. "I have been alone for so long. I thought I wanted to be alone. But then I saw you on that mountain, shaking with cold, and something in me woke up. Something I thought was dead. Every time I leave you, it gets harder. Every time I ride back to my cabin, it feels emptier. I do not know how to be around people anymore. I do not know how to be anything but what I am, but I know that I think about you every day. I know that the thought of anything happening to you makes me want to tear the world apart." "Then do not leave," Beatrice whispered. "Stay. Or let me come with you. I do not care where as long as we are together." Vincent's expression was tortured. "You deserve better than a broken man who lives in the mountains. You are not broken. You are strong and kind and good, and I do not care about anything except being with you. The town needs you. The children need you. I need you more." They stood there in the middle of the street, wrapped in each other's arms, oblivious to the watching townspeople and the chaos still unfolding around them. All that mattered was this moment, this truth between them. Finally, Vincent leaned down and rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm on her face. "I do not know how to do this. I have been alone so long." "Then we will figure it out together," Beatrice said. "We have time. We have all the time we need." Vincent pulled her close again, and Beatrice felt the tension drain from his body as he held her. They stood like that until Sheriff Talbot cleared his throat nearby. "Hate to interrupt," the sheriff said with a kindly smile, "but I need Vincent's statement about what happened here. And Miss Norton, you should probably check on your students. Emma and Thomas are pretty shaken up." Reality intruded, and Beatrice reluctantly stepped out of Vincent's embrace. But she kept hold of his hand, lacing her fingers through his, and he held on just as tightly. Over the next few hours, statements were taken. The outlaws were secured in the jail to await transportation to the territorial prison, and the town slowly returned to normal. Beatrice checked on all her students, making sure they were safe and calming their fears. Vincent gave his statement to the sheriff in his characteristically brief way, then waited patiently for Beatrice to finish her duties. When she was finally done, when the last worried parent had collected their child, and the last curious townsperson had offered their thanks to Vincent for his bravery, Beatrice and Vincent found themselves alone on the now quiet street. "Walk with me," Beatrice asked. Vincent nodded, and they walked together to the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open desert. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. They found a large rock to sit on, and Beatrice leaned against Vincent's side, his arm coming around her shoulders naturally. "What happens now?" Vincent asked quietly. Beatrice considered the question. What did happen now? She had her teaching position, her responsibilities to the town and her students. Vincent had his cabin, his life in the mountains. They were from different worlds, wanted different things. Or did they? "I love teaching," Beatrice said slowly. I love my students, and I love feeling like I am making a difference. But I also love you. I think I have loved you since you gave me your coat without asking for anything in return, since you made me tea and gave me your bed and kept me safe." "I love you too," Vincent said, the words coming out rough but sincere. "I did not think I could feel this anymore. I thought the war had taken it from me, but you brought it back." Beatrice turned to face him, taking both his hands in hers. "Then we will find a way. Maybe I can teach in the mornings and spend afternoons and evenings at your cabin. Maybe you can build us a house closer to town. Maybe we can do something neither of us has thought of yet, but we will find a way together." Vincent looked at their joined hands, at the contrast between his large, scarred hands and her smaller, softer ones. When he looked back up at her, there was hope in his eyes for the first time. "You would really come to the mountains, leave the town, the comfortable life." "I left Boston for Socorro," Beatrice pointed out. "I left everything I knew for the chance at something meaningful. You are meaningful, Vincent. You are the most meaningful thing I have found." Vincent pulled her close and kissed her, a gentle press of lips that held all the emotion he could not put into words. Beatrice kissed him back, her arms wrapping around his neck, losing herself in the feel of him, the taste of him, the rightness of being in his arms. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. Vincent rested his forehead against hers again, a gesture that was becoming familiar, becoming theirs. "Marry me," he said simply. Beatrice laughed, a sound of pure joy. "Yes, yes, absolutely yes. I do not have a ring. I do not have much to offer you except a cabin and a simple life." "You have you," Beatrice said. "That is all I need." They sat together as the sun set completely and stars began to appear in the darkening sky. They talked about practical matters: when they would marry, where they would live, how to balance Beatrice's teaching with their life together. They talked about the future, about children they might have, about building a life together despite coming from such different worlds. In the end, they decided on a compromise. Vincent would build an addition onto his cabin, making it large enough for both of them to live comfortably. Beatrice would continue teaching during the week, staying at the boarding house as needed, but would spend weekends and school holidays in the mountains with Vincent. During the summer, when school was not in session, she would live at the cabin full-time. It was not conventional, but nothing about their relationship was conventional. The town reacted to the news of their engagement with a mix of surprise and delight. Mrs. Henderson proclaimed that she had known it all along, though she immediately began worrying about the propriety of Beatrice spending time alone with Vincent at his cabin before they were wed. The solution came from an unexpected source. Emma's mother offered to chaperone Beatrice on her first few trips to the cabin, until the wedding could take place. They were married in June, in the small church in Socorro. Beatrice wore a simple white dress that she had sewn herself with help from the women in town. Vincent wore new clothes purchased specially for the occasion, though he looked uncomfortable in the confines of a proper suit. But when Beatrice walked down the aisle toward him, his face transformed with such love and wonder that every woman in the church sighed. The ceremony was brief, as both Beatrice and Vincent preferred. But when Vincent slipped a simple gold band on her finger and she did the same for him, Beatrice felt the rightness of it in her very bones. This was where she was meant to be with this man, building this life. The town threw them a celebration afterward, with food and dancing and well wishes from everyone. Vincent tolerated the attention with his characteristic stoicism, though Beatrice noticed how he stayed close to her side, his hand always finding hers in the crowd. When they finally left the celebration to begin the ride up to the cabin, now their cabin, the townspeople lined the street to wave them off. The ride up the mountain was different this time. Beatrice sat behind Vincent on the horse, her arms around his waist, but now she wore his ring on her finger and his name as her own. Now she was riding toward home, not away from danger. When they reached the cabin, Vincent dismounted and then lifted Beatrice down, but instead of setting her on her feet, he carried her across the threshold. Beatrice laughed in delight, clinging to his shoulders as he navigated the doorway. Inside, the cabin had been transformed. Vincent had built the addition he promised, creating a separate bedroom with a real bed frame and a mattress stuffed with fresh, sweet grass. He had built shelves for Beatrice's books, a larger table for them to share meals, even a rocking chair that he had carved himself. The cabin was still simple, still rustic, but it was clearly a home made for two. "Vincent, it is beautiful," Beatrice said, tears pricking her eyes as she looked around. "I wanted you to be comfortable," Vincent said, setting her down gently. "I know it is not what you are used to, not like Boston." Beatrice turned to face him, cupping his bearded face in her hands. "It is better than Boston. It is ours." That night, they consummated their marriage in the bed Vincent had built, learning each other's bodies with gentle touches and whispered words. Vincent was careful with her, conscious of his size and strength, but Beatrice met his passion with her own. Afterward they lay tangled together, Beatrice's head resting on Vincent's broad chest, his arms wrapped securely around her. "I never thought I would have this," Vincent said quietly into the darkness. "After the war, I thought I was too broken, too damaged. I came to the mountains to hide from the world. And I came to the West to find purpose," Beatrice replied. "I found so much more than that. You found a silent mountain man who barely talks." Beatrice smiled against his chest. "I found a man who gives his coat to a freezing stranger, who risks his life to protect others, who builds furniture with his own hands and makes tea from pine needles, who loves quietly but deeply. I found everything I did not know I needed." Vincent tightened his arms around her, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I love you, Beatrice Oakes." "I love you too, Vincent Oakes." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, the firelight casting dancing shadows on the walls of the cabin. The months that followed established a rhythm to their lives. During the school year, Beatrice taught Monday through Friday, staying in her room at the boarding house during the week. But every Friday afternoon, Vincent would be waiting at the edge of town with his horse, ready to take her up to the cabin. They would spend the weekends together, working on the homestead, hunting and gathering, simply being together. On Sunday evenings, he would take her back to town, and though the partings were difficult, the anticipation of the next reunion made them bearable. During the summer months, Beatrice lived at the cabin full-time, and it was during those long, golden days that their bond deepened even further. Vincent taught her how to shoot, how to trap, how to read the weather in the clouds and the behavior of animals. Beatrice taught Vincent to read and write beyond the basic level he had achieved, opening up worlds of literature and ideas that he had never explored. They worked side by side in their garden, growing vegetables and herbs. Vincent hunted and Beatrice learned to cure the meat and tan the hides. They explored the mountains together, Vincent showing her secret places of stunning beauty, hidden waterfalls, meadows filled with wildflowers, caves with ancient paintings on the walls. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, and Beatrice would read aloud while Vincent worked on some carving or repair project. Or they would simply talk, sharing their thoughts and dreams. Vincent spoke more with Beatrice than he had with anyone in years, and though he would never be a chatty man, he found comfort in sharing his inner life with her. Their lovemaking grew more confident and passionate as they learned what pleased each other. Sometimes it was gentle and tender, Vincent's large hands worshiping every inch of her body with reverent care. Other times it was urgent and fierce, both of them desperate to be as close as possible. Always, it left them both satisfied and even more connected than before. A year into their marriage, Beatrice discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but when the town doctor confirmed it, she felt a surge of joy so intense it took her breath away. She could hardly wait to tell Vincent. That Friday, when he met her at the edge of town, Beatrice practically vibrated with excitement on the ride up to the cabin. Vincent noticed. Of course he noticed everything about her and kept giving her questioning glances. Once they were inside the cabin and Beatrice had removed her coat, she turned to Vincent with a brilliant smile. "I have news." Vincent set down the supplies he had been carrying and gave her his full attention. "Good news, I hope," given that smile. "The best news." "Vincent, we are going to have a baby." For a moment, Vincent simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, wonder spread across his face. "A baby, you are certain?" The doctor confirmed it today. "I am about 2 months along, he thinks. The baby should come in February." Vincent crossed the room in 2 strides and swept Beatrice into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around. Beatrice laughed in delight, clutching his shoulders. When he set her down, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "We are going to be parents," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We are," Beatrice confirmed, placing his large hand on her still flat stomach. "Our child. Yours and mine." Vincent dropped to his knees and pressed his forehead against her stomach, his arms coming around her waist. Beatrice ran her fingers through his long hair, her own tears falling freely now. "I will build a cradle," Vincent said, his voice muffled against her dress. "And toys. I will teach him to hunt and fish. I will protect you both with my life." "I know you will," Beatrice said softly. "You are going to be a wonderful father." Vincent looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw all his fears that he was too rough, too scarred by the war, too removed from normal society to raise a child properly. Beatrice cupped his face in her hands, making him meet her gaze. "You are the strongest, kindest, most honorable man I know," she said firmly. "Our child is lucky to have you as a father. I am lucky to have you as my husband." Vincent stood and pulled her into a gentle embrace, careful now in a way he had not been before, conscious of the precious life growing inside her. They stood together for a long time, processing the magnitude of this change in their lives. Over the following months, Vincent threw himself into preparations for the baby. He built a beautiful cradle from pine, sanding it until it was smooth as silk and carving intricate designs into the headboard. He made a rocking horse, small toys, a changing table. He hunted with even more determination, building up stores of dried meat and preserved food. He cut firewood until they had enough to last through multiple winters. Beatrice watched all this preparation with love and amusement. She continued teaching through the fall, though she had to let out her dresses as her belly grew. The children in her class were fascinated by the pregnancy, the younger ones asking endless questions that Beatrice answered with patience and age-appropriate honesty. As winter approached and her pregnancy advanced, Beatrice made the decision to take a leave from teaching. The journey up and down the mountain was becoming too difficult, and she wanted to be at the cabin for the birth. The town understood, and several of the mothers threw her a celebration before she left, giving her handmade blankets, tiny clothes, and advice both welcome and overwhelming. Vincent did not leave her side during those final months. He postponed his supply runs, having stocked up on everything they might need. He was attentive to her every need, bringing her tea when she was nauseous, rubbing her swollen feet, reading aloud to distract her when she grew uncomfortable. When her labor began on a cold February night, Vincent was terrified in a way Beatrice had never seen. This man who had faced down armed outlaws without flinching was pale and shaking as he helped her through the contractions. "I should get the doctor," he said for the 10th time. "I should ride to town and bring back the doctor." "There is no time," Beatrice gasped between contractions. "Besides, women have been having babies without doctors since the beginning of time. We can do this." Vincent looked far from convinced, but he stayed by her side, holding her hand and providing support as she labored through the night. When the baby finally came with the dawn, a healthy boy with a shock of dark hair and a powerful set of lungs, Vincent caught him with shaking hands and tears streaming down his face. "A son," he whispered, staring at the tiny, squalling infant. "We have a son." Beatrice, exhausted but elated, reached for the baby. Vincent placed him gently in her arms, then sank down beside the bed, his large hand cupping the baby's tiny head with infinite care. "Hello, little one," Beatrice murmured, studying every perfect detail of her son's face. "Welcome to the world." "What should we name him?" Vincent asked, his voice hushed with awe. Beatrice had been thinking about this for months. "I would like to name him William after your father, and Vincent as his middle name after you." Vincent's eyes filled with fresh tears. He had told her about his father during one of their long evenings by the fire, about the good man who had died when Vincent was young. To have his son carry that name meant everything. "William Vincent Oakes," Vincent said, testing out the name. "It is perfect." The baby quieted at the sound of his father's deep voice, his tiny fist waving in the air. Vincent offered his finger, and William grasped it with surprising strength. Vincent looked at his son holding his finger, at his wife watching them both with love in her eyes, and felt something he had not felt since before the war, complete and utter peace. The years that followed were full and rich. William grew strong and healthy, adored by both his parents and, when they visited town, by the entire community of Socorro. Beatrice returned to teaching when William was old enough, bringing him with her to the schoolhouse where he played happily while she taught. Vincent continued to provide for his family through hunting and trapping, but he also began taking on occasional work for townspeople, using his skills to build and repair things. 2 years after William was born, their daughter arrived, a red-haired, green-eyed little girl they named Victoria. She was followed 3 years later by another son, Thomas, who inherited his father's gray eyes and quiet demeanor. The cabin expanded to accommodate their growing family. Vincent built additional rooms, a larger table, more beds. The walls filled with the noise and chaos of children, laughter replacing the silence that had once defined Vincent's existence. Beatrice continued teaching, her classroom growing as Socorro expanded. She gained a reputation as one of the finest teachers in the territory, but her greatest joy was always her own children and the life she had built with Vincent. Vincent, for his part, transformed from a solitary mountain man into a devoted husband and father. He never lost his quiet nature, his preference for actions over words, but his children learned to read the love in his gestures, the way he would tousle their hair, the pride in his eyes when they learned something new, the gentleness of his large hands when they skinned a knee or needed comfort. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Vincent and Beatrice stood together on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching their children play in the meadow beyond. William, now 9, was teaching Victoria to shoot with a small bow Vincent had made. Thomas, barely 4, was attempting to follow along, his chubby legs carrying him after his siblings. "You ever regret it?" Vincent asked, his arm around Beatrice's waist. "Leaving Boston, marrying me, choosing this life?" Beatrice leaned into his solid warmth, just as she had so many times over the years. Never, not for a single moment. Even when you have to live part of the year in a cabin in the mountains, especially then, Beatrice said firmly. This is my home. You are my home. Our children, our life together, this is everything I ever wanted and more than I ever dreamed of. Vincent pressed a kiss to her temple. I love you, Beatrice, more with every passing year. I love you too, Beatrice replied. My mountain man who gave me his coat. Vincent smiled at the reference to their first meeting, that cold November evening that had changed both their lives forever. Best decision I ever made. Not asking me first. Did not need to ask. Your teeth were chattering. You needed the coat. Everything else followed from that. Beatrice turned in his arms to face him properly. Everything good in my life started the moment you gave me that coat. Before that, I was lost, freezing, afraid. You saved me in more ways than one. You saved me too, Vincent said seriously. I was alive, but I was not living. You brought me back to life, Beatrice. You and our children, you are everything. They kissed, a sweet press of lips that still, after 10 years of marriage and 3 children, made Beatrice's heart race. When they pulled apart, they turned back to watch their children. Vincent's arms wrapped around Beatrice from behind, her hands resting over his. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant colors. The air was filled with the sounds of their children's laughter and the evening songs of birds settling in for the night. The cabin behind them was warm and welcoming, a true home built on love and trust, and the quiet strength that had defined them from the beginning. Beatrice thought back to that scared young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in New Mexico, determined to find purpose in teaching children. She had found that purpose, yes, but she had found so much more. She had found love in its truest form, a love that asked nothing, that gave everything, that saw past surfaces to the heart beneath. She had found her home, not in a place but in a person. In a man who had seen her in need and responded without hesitation, who had given her his coat and in doing so had given her his heart. William ran up to the porch, his face flushed with excitement. Papa, did you see? I hit the target 3 times. Vincent ruffled his son's dark hair with obvious pride. I saw. You are improving every day. Victoria appeared next, demanding equal attention. I hit it twice, Mama. Wonderful job, sweetheart, Beatrice said warmly. Thomas toddled up last, reaching his arms up to his father. Vincent scooped him up effortlessly, settling the little boy on his hip. Thomas immediately snuggled into his father's broad chest, his eyes growing heavy. Let us go inside, Beatrice suggested. I will start supper. They moved as a family into the warmth of the cabin, the children chattering about their day while Vincent and Beatrice shared a smile over their heads. This was their life, simple, beautiful, filled with love. That night, after the children were asleep in their beds and the cabin was quiet, Beatrice and Vincent sat together by the fire. She was mending one of William's shirts while Vincent carved a new toy for Thomas. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes from years of deep companionship. You remember what you told me that night? Beatrice asked suddenly. When I asked if you got lonely in the mountains, Vincent set down his carving and looked at her. I said sometimes. You also said the quiet helped, that after the war you needed the peace. I remember. You still need that. The quiet, I mean, because our life is anything but quiet now. Vincent considered the question seriously, as he considered all her questions. Then he shook his head. I thought I needed silence, but what I really needed was peace. There is a difference. Silence is empty. Peace is full of love, of purpose, of connections that matter. You brought me peace, Beatrice. You and our children, you are my peace. Beatrice set aside her mending and moved to sit on Vincent's lap, something she had done countless times over the years. He wrapped his arms around her, and she rested her head on his shoulder. "I was so scared that night on the mountain," she admitted. "So cold and certain I was going to die. And then you appeared, this massive, intimidating man, and somehow I knew I would be all right. I could not explain it then, but I knew." "I knew too," Vincent said. "The moment I saw you, something in me recognized something in you, like you were the answer to a question I had not known to ask." They sat together in front of the fire, just as they had on their first night together, but everything was different now. Then, they had been strangers brought together by chance and necessity. Now they were husband and wife, partners in every sense of the word, bound by love and years of shared experience. "Thank you," Beatrice whispered. "For what?" "For the coat. For the safety. For the love, for this life, for everything." Vincent kissed the top of her head, his arms tightening around her. "No, Beatrice. Thank you. You took a broken man hiding in the mountains and made him whole again. You gave me a family, a purpose, a reason to live instead of just survive. I did not think I deserved a second chance after everything I had done, everything I had seen. But you gave me one anyway." "We gave each other second chances," Beatrice corrected gently. "I was running from a life I did not want, from expectations I could not meet. You helped me find the life I needed." They stayed up late into the night, talking and holding each other, reconnecting in the way that couples do when they take time away from the demands of children and daily life. When they finally went to bed, they made love with the practiced ease of long familiarity, each knowing exactly how to please the other, the passion between them undimmed by years of marriage. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the bed Vincent had built with his own hands, Beatrice thought about how far they had both come. From that cold November evening to this warm, love-filled life, the journey had been everything she never knew she needed. The years continued to pass, marked by the growth of their children and the deepening of their own bond. William grew into a strong, responsible young man who possessed his father's quiet strength and his mother's quick mind. Victoria inherited Beatrice's love of learning and Vincent's connection to the natural world, becoming an avid reader who could also track a deer through the forest. Thomas remained the quietest of the three, content to shadow his father and learn the skills of mountain living. When William turned 18, he announced his intention to join the army. Vincent, who had not spoken of his war experiences to his children beyond the barest facts, took his son aside for a long conversation. What passed between them remained private, but when William emerged from that talk, he had decided instead to use his skills to become a guide for travelers through the mountain passes, keeping people safe the way his father had once kept his mother safe. Victoria followed her mother into teaching, opening a small school in a neighboring settlement. She married a kind young rancher and filled Vincent and Beatrice's lives with grandchildren who would climb all over their grandfather and beg for stories. Thomas chose to stay in the mountains, building his own cabin not far from his parents, and taking over much of the hunting and trapping that had once been Vincent's primary occupation. He found happiness in the solitary life that suited him, though he came to his parents' cabin often for meals and companionship. As Beatrice and Vincent grew older, they spent more time together at the cabin and less in town. Beatrice eventually retired from teaching, having trained a younger woman to take over her classroom. She and Vincent would sit together on their porch, watching the mountains change with the seasons, their hands always finding each other. On the 50th anniversary of the night Vincent had given Beatrice his coat, their entire family gathered at the cabin for a celebration. Children and grandchildren filled the house and spilled out into the meadow. There was food and music and laughter. At one point, one of the granddaughters, a bright-eyed 10-year-old named Sarah, climbed into Vincent's lap. "Grandpa, tell us the story again, about how you and Grandma met." Vincent, now in his 70s but still strong and vital, smiled at the request. His long hair had gone silver, and his beard was more white than dark, but his gray eyes were as sharp and clear as ever. "It was a cold November evening," he began, and Beatrice, sitting beside him, took his hand and added her voice to the telling. They recounted the story together, the way they had many times over the years. About the broken stagecoach and the freezing mountain pass. About the coat given without hesitation. About the silent ride to the cabin and the trust that grew between them. About coffee meetings that turned into courtship and a love that had lasted half a century. The children and grandchildren listened with rapt attention, even those who had heard the story before, because it was not just a story about how their grandparents met. It was a story about kindness and trust, about seeing someone in need and responding without hesitation. It was a story about two people from different worlds finding each other and building something beautiful together. When the story was finished and the celebration was winding down, Beatrice and Vincent found themselves alone on the porch once more. Their children were inside, cleaning up and preparing to leave. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold. 50 years, Beatrice said softly. 50 years since you gave me your coat." "Best coat I ever owned," Vincent replied, "given to the best woman I ever met. Do you remember what you said to me in the hotel that day, after the outlaws?" "I said a lot of things that day." "You said you thought the war had taken your ability to feel from you, but that I brought it back." Vincent nodded, remembering. "It was true." "Well, I want you to know something. Every day for the past 50 years you have made me feel loved, cherished, safe. You have given me the most beautiful life I could have imagined. 3 incredible children, a house full of love, adventures and quiet moments, and everything in between. You gave me yourself, Vincent, and that was the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." Vincent's eyes grew bright with moisture. Even after all these years, Beatrice's words could move him deeply. "You gave me a reason to live again, Beatrice. Before you, I was just existing, waiting for time to pass. You made me want to be alive. You made me want to be better. You made me believe I deserved happiness. Everything good in my life comes from you." They kissed, a gentle press of lips that held 50 years of love, of shared joys and weathered sorrows, of partnership and passion and unwavering commitment. When their grandson came out to tell them it was getting late and the family should head home before dark, he found them still sitting close together, hands intertwined, watching the sun set over the mountains they both loved so much. The family departed with hugs and promises to visit again soon. Thomas stayed to help bank the fire and ensure his aging parents were settled for the night. When he finally left, heading to his own cabin through the familiar forest paths, Beatrice and Vincent were alone once more. They prepared for bed with the ease of long habit, moving around each other in the small space with practiced efficiency. When they finally lay down together, Beatrice curled into Vincent's side just as she had done for 50 years. "Thank you for the coat," she whispered into the darkness. Vincent's arm tightened around her, and she felt his lips press against her forehead. "Thank you for taking it." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, the same way they had slept for half a century. Outside, the mountains stood silent and eternal, keeping watch over the cabin and the love that had flourished within its walls. Beatrice and Vincent lived many more years together in their mountain home, surrounded by the love of their family and sustained by the bond they had forged that cold November night. They grew old together, their bodies slowing but their love never diminishing. Vincent's silver hair grew longer, and Beatrice's auburn turned to white, but when they looked at each other, they still saw the young woman shivering on a mountain path and the strong man who had given her his coat. When Vincent finally passed away at the age of 83, it was peacefully in his sleep, with Beatrice holding his hand. Beatrice followed him 2 years later, having lived long enough to see all her children settled and happy, her grandchildren grown, and even a few great-grandchildren born. They were buried together on the mountain they both loved, in a spot overlooking the meadow where their children had played and their love had grown. Their family placed a simple marker that read, "Vincent and Beatrice Oakes, united by a coat, bound by love together forever." The cabin still stands, maintained by their descendants who use it as a gathering place for family celebrations. And sometimes, on cold November evenings, people swear they can see two figures sitting on the porch, hands intertwined, watching the sun set over the mountains, a mountain man and the woman he loved, together still in the place where their story began. The legacy of their love lived on through their children and grandchildren, through the kindness they showed to strangers, through the example they set of what true partnership looks like. They had built something lasting, not just in the physical cabin and the family they raised, but in the way they loved each other without reservation, without condition, with quiet strength and unwavering commitment. Their story became a legend in Socorro, told and retold over the years. The tale of the mountain man who gave his coat to a freezing stranger and found his soulmate. The story of the brave schoolteacher who trusted a silent stranger and discovered her home. It was a reminder that love could be found in the most unexpected places, between the most unlikely people, and that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the smallest acts of kindness. And so their love story ended where all the best love stories end, not with an ending at all, but with a legacy that would continue through generations. In the children they raised to be strong and kind. In the grandchildren who learned from their example. In the great-grandchildren who played in the meadow near their graves. In every act of kindness given without expectation of return. In every coat offered to someone shivering in the cold. Vincent and Beatrice Oakes had built a life together that mattered, and in the end, that was all either of them had ever wanted. They had found each other in the wilderness, two lost souls who became each other's home. And the love that began with a silent gift of warmth on a cold mountain night had illuminated both their lives and the lives of everyone they touched, burning bright and true until the very end and beyond.